appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming out on a busy Thursday to come out and talk to me. I really appreciate you doing that. It means a lot to me when I have guests who are willing to come out and spend their own time and sit down and talk to me. But we have a lot of interesting things to talk about today, so I'm really glad that you took the time to come out here. Thank you again.
It's great to be here.
Well, really fast, just before we get into it, I wanted to give the audience an idea of who you are and some of the things that you've accomplished. As I was doing my research on you a couple of weeks back, a lot of the stuff just really impressed me, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to reach out to you. So you are a professor of politics and international studies at University of San Francisco, and you're the coordinator of Middle East Studies, which is very impressive. You're the senior policy analyst for Foreign Policy in Focus. You were the associate editor of Peace Review, and you got your BA from Oberlin College, class of 79, MA degree from Temple, class of 83, and your PhD from Cornell in class of 1990. You were awarded the Peace Scholar of the Year from the Peace and Justice Studies Association in 2002. One of the few people who went public about doubts that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction prior to the 2003 invasion. In 2007, this was really impressive. You met with then Iranian President Ahmadinejad, if I'm saying that correctly. You have 3 children, and you're an avid folk musician. So we'll see if that comes up here. And you're the author of 4 books, including the most recent in 2010 called Western Sahara, War, Nationalism, and Conflict Resolution.
The second revised, expanded paperback edition just came out a couple months ago.
It came out? Congratulations. I want to take a look at that one. And you're also a frequent guest on MSNBC, the BBC, PBS, and NPR, and you're known internationally as an outspoken critic of U.S. policy in the Middle East. Regarding the Israel-Palestine issue, you've been an outspoken critic of U.S. backing of both Israel and some of the Arab states, but you're also an outspoken critic of the Israeli government in carrying out what you call human rights violations, and at the same time are very critical of the far-left position on Israel, which does not believe to a certain extent that Israel's right should even have to be a right to exist. These are definitely 2 stances that we just don't hear about in the United States over here, so definitely something I want to get to. But thank you again. That's a very impressive resume. So again, thank you again for coming on here.
Yeah, pleasure being with you. As I say, the one correction is I recently passed on the chairmanship of the Middle Eastern Studies program to a junior colleague, though I've founded it and ran it for 10 years, and it's going great.
That's excellent there. One of the things that came up in my research to look at what's been going on within the Middle East was pretty much what's going on today with the Ukraine and Russia. One of the things that you brought up in one of the articles that you wrote goes back to the Western Sahara. And I want you to spend a little time talking about that because I found it very fascinating. It was something that I consider myself some sort of a history buff, and I never even heard of this as being an issue here. But from what I understand, this goes back to the country of Morocco and how they pretty much annexed what internationally was recognized as the Western Sahara, which was its own independent region. And through the political, I guess you would say, will of the United States to recognize Morocco's annexation of the Western Sahara, it sort of set up the precedent for what we're seeing now in the Ukraine between Russia and what's going on there. So can you kind of explain to the audience what that is?
Well, sure. Western Sahara is a country just south of Morocco on the Atlantic coast. It's about the size of Colorado, mostly desert, as you might expect. They are a people who, like Moroccans, are a mixture of Arabs and Berbers. They are Sunni Muslims, and yet they have a very distinct culture, a unique dialect that's very different than the kind of Arabic spoken in Morocco. They have a history of independence. They've never really been part of Morocco. For hundreds of years, they were a Spanish colony. And when they started an armed struggle for independence, Spain was holding on to its territories longer than most of the European colonialists. And Spain agreed to hand it over for a new independent state in 1975. But Morocco had other ideas. Morocco wanted to expand their territory southward. They claimed
Really fast. Can you bring this a little closer to you? There we
go. They claimed with rather dubious claims about historical ties. The International Court of Justice ruled unanimously that these historical ties did not constitute sovereignty. That the people of Western Sahara, like any colony that was in the process of decolonization, had a choice of what to do. They could vote to join Morocco in a referendum if they wanted to, but it was pretty clear from UN investigations and others they wanted an independent state. The United States pressured a reluctant Spain to allow Morocco to move in. They moved in forcefully. The Polisario Front, which was the nationalist group fighting for independence from Spain, then had to turn their guns on their new conqueror, the Moroccans, and they basically gobbled up the country, annexed it to Morocco. The United Nations Security Council voted unanimously that, hey, you can't do that. You have to have self-determination. You have to withdraw from the territory. But the United States and France are allies of Morocco and thought that the Polisario might be too left-wing or whatever, blocked the UN from actually enforcing the resolutions. And so there have been years of negotiations, guerrilla war, nonviolent resistance. But the big shock came in December of 2020, in Trump's final weeks in office, when he formally recognized this occupied territory as part of Morocco. And this is virtually the only country that has done so. The rest of the international community sees it as a non-self-governing territory, an incomplete decolonization, an occupied territory. And it's very bizarre. If you look at maps from the United Nations, if you look at maps from Rand McNally, National Geographic, Google, they're two separate countries. But on all U.S. government maps, it's one. There's no demarcation whatsoever. And so here we have the irony of President Biden, quite correctly, telling the Russians, hey, you cannot unilaterally change international boundaries. You cannot expand your borders by force. But then you have the United States supporting an ally doing the exact same thing.
That was, when I first read that article that you wrote, it really put it into perspective here, because it's not something that we, excuse me, this thing acts up sometimes. It's not something that we really talk about here, that from the point of view of what most people in this country see on the media, it was just pretty much just going to the Ukraine thing. Like, how dare Russia invade a sovereign country? They're an independent sovereign country, have been since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Why do they think it's okay to go in there and basically, bring it back into the Federation when they're an independent country? So naturally speaking, people hear that and they say that's just not right. We should do things to help them, whether it's through NATO, whether it's through humanitarian aid. And there's been plenty of efforts around here to sort of raise funding to send to Ukraine to help them in their struggle against Russia. But then when we talked about the whole issue with the Western Sahara and Morocco, it's not something that ever came up here. I don't know anybody besides people who are really into history that would even know that was even a thing. So it really puts it into perspective. What if you could be, as transparent as possible, what do you think is really behind why we're so interested in the Ukraine issue as far as the U.S. government's concerned, when really from the Moroccan point of view, we just said, they took them over and that was it.
Well, it's the same reason that the United States will quite justifiably criticize Iran for its human rights abuses, its suppression of the rights of women, minority, its support for extremist groups, its interference in other countries, and then arm the Saudis, who are worse in all the as bad or worse in all those categories as well. The kind of double standard that we've long had towards autocratic regimes, governments that violate international legal norms. It's like they look at whether they're aligned to the United States or not, and then they'll decide whether it's okay or not. Now, you have some people on the far left who do it the other way around, who rationalize for governments like Venezuela or Nicaragua or even Assad and Putin, but while criticizing U.S.-backed regimes. But the fact is international law, you don't make that distinction. I mean, a Republican attorney general wouldn't get away with just prosecuting Democrats. A Democratic attorney general would not get away with just prosecuting Republicans. The law is the law. And that's true with international law as much as domestic law. And though it may be harder to enforce, that principle of equality under the law remains. And that is something that has driven my work on this, that I try to avoid the ideological issues, whether a government's left-wing or right-wing or pro-American or anti-American, that if you violate human rights, if you violate international legal norms, and particularly if you invade and occupy and oppress and colonize a weaker neighbor, that's wrong.
That definitely is. And what was really important to me is that you had talked about this early February, late January, before before Russia even went into Ukraine, just about how the precedent that we set with just Morocco, for example, just pretty much gave Putin the A-OK, saying, well, if they did it, then why can't I do it? But in terms of What do you think is in Putin's head? If you can actually have a crystal ball to see what is it that he actually wants, is it really all about I don't want NATO at my doorstep? Is it about I want to bring back Kyiv into the Russian Federation, since that's pretty much where the culture started at? Or is there something else going on there that maybe we don't know?
I mean, it's possible he's fallen into the Russian paranoia, the fact they've been invaded from Europe via Ukraine 4 times over the past couple centuries. It might be because there's he didn't like the way that NATO was expanding eastward and the like. But frankly, given his rhetoric about Ukraine, being inherently part of Russia and that it's not its own nation, I have a feeling he would invade them anyway. So I don't make excuses for him. I think part of it, frankly, is some of your listeners may remember back in during the Cold War, where the United States would freak out if there's a country in our hemisphere that tried to go in a more socialist direction. We did not want a successful socialist experiment because we were afraid other countries might emulate it. And I think in the case of Putin, he doesn't want Ukraine. They've really struggled since independence. Both the pro-Russian and the pro-Western governments that have alternated have been rather corrupt. And here we had this outsider, Zelensky, come in and promise to clean up things. He's only partially successful, but gave hope that the Ukrainians would have a more European future, a more liberal democratic future. And they seem to be in fits and starts heading in that direction. And I think that's what Putin was scared of, that there was a threat of a good example, a threat that there would be a prosperous, liberal, European country next door with a people that do share similar cultural and have historical and cultural commonalities, and afraid that some Russians might look at Ukraine and say, hey, we need to be more like that and not the kind of system that Putin's running.
Well, I think it's fair to say that this is not going the way he intended it to go. He probably thought, get in there a couple of days, special forces, take the government out, put a puppet one in, and then no one's going to say anything. I don't think it's gone anywhere near the way that he planned it was actually going now. So at this point now, if you could guess, what do you think the end game is for him now? Is he just full in? I mean, I'm ride or die, and if it means I have to sacrifice X amount of my soldiers, I'm going to do it until I take over the government? Or do you think that there's actually room there for him to save face and say, all right, at this point, maybe I can find a way where I feel like I win, but I don't really give the West what they want?
It's possible. I mean, there could be an agreement that Ukraine would be neutral, status similar to Austria and Finland during the Cold War. They were able to be prosperous and democratic and independent and secure without but not aligned, not part of NATO. I mean, Zelensky has essentially agreed to that, but it's possible he could do that and declare victory, perhaps some degree of autonomy of some of the predominantly Russian-speaking areas. Though I would quickly add that not every ethnic Russian Ukrainian wants to be part of Russia. I mean, Zelensky himself is an ethnic Russian,
right.
So that may be that it would be complicated, but they could probably figure out some kind of a compromise there. But it's clear they're not winning. I mean, they are being bogged down. It is something that we've seen invaders happen to invaders. I remember Dick Cheney talking about how Iraq would be a cakewalk, and not to mention what both the Soviets and the Americans thought they could do in Afghanistan. We could go on in Israel and Lebanon, U.S. and Vietnam. That just because you have the dominant firepower doesn't mean you're going to win, especially if you are the invader, because people will fight to defend their country. They may or may not like the government that much or whatever, but it's their land. It's not the invader's land, and they will give all to defend it. Whereas these Russian conscripts with poor supply lines, with low morale, with abuse, I mean, how hard are they going to fight? What are they willing to sacrifice? And so motivation has a huge factor in this kind of asymmetrical conflict.
So, from the world's point of view, what is it? What's different about Ukraine that wasn't there for Chechnya, for Georgia, for Crimea, even, where we just kind of said, "All right, yeah, you shouldn't do that, Putin, but we're just gonna kind of hope it goes away." What was it about Ukraine where they just put their foot down and said, "Nah"?
Well, I think it's the scale of the operation. Actually, in the case of Chechnya, the breakaway government. It did include some hardline Islamist elements, and we were all into this whole war on terror, so we're kind of willing to look the other way there. In the case of Georgia, it was an incursion. It wasn't a full-scale invasion. They did recognize this breakaway autonomous region of Georgia, but they were pretty much on quasi-independent already. Crimea, it was peaceful because the Russians had all these military bases there. That was part of the agreement when the Soviet Union broke up, so they could just fan out a little bit, and they had a largely ethnic Russian population. I mean, the referendum they had was phony. I mean, there wasn't it wasn't the 90% or whatever they said, but there's no question of large numbers. Perhaps a majority didn't mind becoming a part of Russia. But this is the scale of the operation, the horror, I mean, the deadly nature, the destruction, the fact that these people clearly do not want to be part of Russia. Clearly that Russia is trying to actually take it over, not just do a little punitive thing like they did with Georgia. Really puts it on a whole different scale.
What do you think the role of Belarus is going to be with all this? I mean, you got Lukashenko there. He's pretty much the last dictator in Europe. And I would think he'd have a hard decision to make because if he assists Russia in going in, he risks, I think at some level, maybe getting kicked out of power to a certain extent. But if he stays where he's at, how does he support his big ally in Putin?
Well, he came pretty close to being kicked out through massive nonviolent protests that went on for the better part of last year. And there's not a lot of sympathy among the Belarusian population to what Putin is doing. They don't want to be in the crosshairs of an international conflict. And there have been some interesting little acts of sabotage, like the railway workers union in Belarus ended up pulling up the tracks in a lot of places to make it difficult for the Russians to resupply their forces by train.
Wow.
And so I think Lukashenko is just trying to hold tight and get out of the way and hope that he won't be dragged in more than he wants to be.
I mean, that makes total sense there. But then what does this do for Sweden and Finland, who have been notoriously been neutral throughout this whole thing? And just the fact that they're even talking about joining NATO now, and then what kind of pressure does that put on Russia at this point if they're bogged down in Ukraine and now all of a sudden Finland says, yeah, we're going to be a part of the NATO, which is a 300+ mile long border they have with Russia. What does he do there? Do you think he takes the extreme measure of using his more advanced weapons because he feels he's being come at it from all sides at this point?
Well, I think the big one of the ironies of this whole thing is if NATO was really the problem, if that was really the concern of Putin, that his actions have justified NATO's existence. I mean, a lot of people argue, hey, the Cold War is over. If NATO was formed as a balance to the Soviet Union and its allies, and so the Soviet Union broken up, and the Eastern European countries free and pro-West, why do we need NATO anymore? And as I mentioned, there's even more controversy when NATO moved eastward and incorporated many of these former Warsaw Pact countries and even 3 former Soviet republics, the Baltic republics, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And so, there are a lot of people, myself included, who are kind of skeptical as, is this really necessary? Is this just a boondoggle for American arms manufacturers to replace the old outdated Soviet equipment so they can be in tandem with the NATO operations, and what is this really for? But what Putin is doing is saying, hey, maybe we do need a NATO, and maybe we need a NATO that moves eastward and incorporates more countries, and maybe the previous neutral countries might want to be part of this alliance now, because this is, in a sense, Putin's actions are giving justification for for NATO's existence, for NATO's expansion. Personally, I doubt that Sweden and Finland would join NATO. I think their history of neutrality is really embedded strongly in the culture, but they have been willing to support Ukraine in various ways. Sweden has provided some military aid. They're helping with refugees and humanitarian aid, and they're definitely being engaged.
And it's no question, like you said, that many of the NATO allies are assisting Ukraine in various ways, not just with arms, humanitarian aid, refugees, taking them in and whatnot. I mean, at what point does all that aid, if you will, cross the line with Putin, where he says, okay, now you've all crossed the line and now you are, aiding my enemy now in Ukraine, while you haven't put your own soldiers' boots on the ground. You're basically giving the Ukrainian army all the weapons in the world. So at what point do you think he says this is enough and then maybe takes drastic action there?
Well, I think the Biden administration and a number of the important countries involved here have been taking a middle line that they're providing defensive weapons, the anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons that have proven so effective. But they, for example, vetoed Poland's
the fighter jets
offer to bring in these MiG fighter jets, which could technically bomb Moscow. So I think the fact that they are avoiding bringing in what's potentially offensive weapons, while working very hard to bring in defensive weapons, is trying to find that balance that gives the Ukrainians support that they need without unnecessarily provoking even harsher Russian responses.
I mean, I guess that makes sense, and we kind of wonder how far does this actually go, because sort of why I think Putin was so emboldened is because he had such an iron grip over Europe as far as oil and gas trade. He's pretty much made them dependent upon Russian energy, and although pretty much most of the European nations have agreed with the United States to try and stop, if not just completely move on from Russian energy, it's a big pill to swallow for many people in Europe. I mean, our gas prices go up here a couple of dollars. We think it's the end of the world, but over there, it's completely everything is dependent upon Russian energy. So could this just be a waiting game for him to say, hey, I have more cards to play than you guys do over in NATO. Eventually, you're going to say, okay, we need Russian gas and energy, so we'll just capitulate and say, all right, well, we put up a good fight with Ukraine, but now we're just going to go back to working with Russia with all the energy concerns.
Well, a number of things are happening, though. The Algerians, the Qataris, and other suppliers of natural gas have agreed to increase their production. This, of course, is a big boon for those of us who've been arguing for a long time that we should be less dependent on carbon sources of energy and looking for alternatives. And Europe is actually, despite having worse weather than here, is actually more advanced than we are here in the United States in terms of solar and wind and other renewables. And I think the Europeans who've experienced, of course, aggression throughout the decades and the centuries, see the importance of this and are willing to deal with higher prices and perhaps even shortages in order to make sure that Russia does not get away with this. I mean, of course, this is a broader problem. I mean, look at what the United States has done vis-a-vis the Saudis. I mean, this is a government that still executes women for witchcraft. I mean, this is the government that has killed many tens of thousands of Yemeni civilians. This is a government that murdered a Washington Post journalist. And yet, Biden is still willing to sell them arms and provide all this security assistance and logistical support and buy their oil and make nice with them. And this is one, in addition, obviously, to the problem of a rapidly warming planet. The fact is that these petrostates, because of the dependency on oil, can get away with stuff that they otherwise wouldn't get away with. And of course, it's of course, the Patrick Henry's famous line that we like to quote a lot about. No taxation without representation. It works the other way as well. If you're a rentier state, if you have all this oil, you don't need to have taxes. that people you'll really care what you're not dependent on your people as much for your survival, so you can get away with more, and you can you can be a dictatorship. I mean, it's no accident that there's indeed a correlation between countries with high that have all this oil and gas and the lack of political freedom. And so again, add this to another list about why we need to go to renewable energy. Well, we need to starve these guys.
I mean, it definitely makes sense from that point of view why we should be focusing so much on renewable energy. And another thing that most people probably don't realize here is that the United States is either the number 1 or number 2 oil producer in the world. But yet a lot of what we still bring in is foreign oil. I think Russian oil was like 10%. I'm not sure what the other countries make up of it, but it kind of says, if we have to keep using fossil fuels for longer, don't we have the resources within our own country to be self-serving with that and not have to worry about bringing in other oil from other countries? Or is it because we're doing them a favor in some way? Because by buying, let's say, Saudi oil, it allows us to have influence within the Middle East. We buy your oil, so we get a seat at the table as to what goes on over there.
Yeah, and of course, all the money we pay for oil, they pay us in terms of jet fighters and all this military equipment. It helps out with our trade deficit. It gives Bechtel and other contractors money to build things over there. The prestige projects they have. It benefits wealthy people, but it doesn't benefit ordinary people. But interesting that just how this circles back to Western Sahara. Algeria, as I mentioned, had agreed to increase its its natural gas supply. Well, about 10 days ago, I'll just go back a little further. Congress, concerned about the situation in Western Sahara, I mean, it's really bad. I mean, the repression is terrible. Freedom House, which is a Washington, D.C. based think tank that has a quantitative measure of human rights standards around the world and democracy and that kind of thing. In terms of political rights, they rank Morocco-occupied Western Sahara as having the least political rights of any country in the world, save for Syria. And I've been there myself, and I've been in 85 countries, including Iraq under Saddam and Indonesia under Suharto. I've never seen a worse police state. So again, the Moroccans are saying that we will grant them autonomy. We won't give them independence, but autonomy. But autonomy under autocratic governments, Ethiopia and Eritrea, Serbia and Kosovo, it doesn't turn out very well, and it's and very centralized state, and they've broken all their promises before. Nobody takes this autonomy thing seriously because it's if you don't it doesn't meet the international definition of autonomy, and it rules out independence. And as a non-self-governing territory that is a colony, self-determination requires the option of independence. So the Congress passed a law just recently, bipartisan, had both Republicans and Democrats behind it, that pushed the idea that there would be no more direct military cooperation between the U.S. and the Moroccan army. They no longer have these joint military exercises until the Moroccan government would make a good faith effort for a political solution that would meet the aspirations of the people of the region, which most of us assume would mean, well, finally they get to have their referendum they've been wanting to have all these years. Well, the Biden administration suddenly declared, oh, this autonomy proposal meets that criteria. And so, therefore, we are waiving the congressional restrictions and we're resuming our military cooperation. And so then Spain got emboldened because of some pressure from Morocco that was threatening to let loose all these African immigrants that are just 12 miles from the Spanish coast across the Straits of Gibraltar, not to mention these two little presidios that Spain owns on the north coast of Morocco. So Spain actually has a little bit of a land border with Morocco.
I remember that.
So Spain came out and they said, this we like this autonomy proposal too, which is a big shift in policy. So then Algeria says, who's a big supporter of Western Sahara, of the independence of Polisario, about a third of the Sahrawi population are in refugee camps in Algeria, says to Spain, okay, we're going to cut back on your natural gas, which Spain is already cutting back. So Secretary of State Blinken is flying into Algiers the next day or two to try to sort this out. So it's amazing. The Western Sahara Ukraine link is coming up to the fore on this level as well.
Wow. The funny thing about that is just in that 3 to 5 minutes that we just spent talking about that, I guarantee you 98% of the people in this country, 99% of people in this country wouldn't even know that was even a link. We're so focused on Ukraine, and rightly so, but it's when you really look at bigger picture, what nobody talks about, it's like this whole thing with how government amendments really work behind the scenes it's really deep. And even for me, just like, what is the U.S.'s interest in Morocco? I mean, they don't seem like to be a country that produces a lot. They don't have a big military force. They're not strategically important as far as where they're at in the Middle East. What is that makes us say, you know what, we'll play along with them?
Well, I mean, we have quite a history in Morocco. They were one of the very first countries to recognize an independent United States back in the late 18th century. The Moroccan monarchy was a very close ally during the Cold War. A lot of Arab countries were flirting with this kind of left-wing nationalism, and there was a revolutionary fervor in parts of Africa, Angola, and places like that. Morocco was steadfastly pro-Western, and the Polisario, they weren't communists, but they were definitely part of this third world, non-aligned, somewhat leftist force that was big at that time in the 1970s. And Henry Kissinger said, "Oh no, we can't have another Angola on the North Atlantic coast," and that's why he pressured Spain to hand it over, illegally hand it over to Morocco. Now, with the Cold War over and the Polisario, saying, "Hey, we're moderate, free market, Atlantic, we're not scary. We're not going to do anything radical. Please grant us our independence." The other thing really amazing about the Polisario is that in all the years of struggle against Morocco, not once did they ever engage in terrorism. And they're also a secular nationalist group. I mean, they're individually observant, but they practice a pretty liberal form of Islam. The women are unveiled. They have equal rights to inheritance and divorce. They keep their maiden names. In fact, women activists in Western Sahara are singled out for sexual abuse in the prisons and other things because the Moroccans find them uppity. They're not as compliant as Moroccan women. And so, but in other words, the Polisario and the independent Western Sahara, and the Western Saharan government, does control about a third of the population, the refugee camps and some of the liberated zones. They've been quite responsible, and they are a full member of the African Union. Have been recognized by more than 80 countries, and so that's one thing that's so weird about the United States, supporting Morocco's takeover. They are recognizing the takeover of one sovereign African country by another. And so, but anyway, an independent Western Sahara would supposedly be what the United States would want: a moderate Arab, Muslim, a country that supports women's rights, human rights. That's not where Islam is a private thing. It's not they're not imposing anything on people. I mean, again, this is what we're supposed a group that never engages in terrorism. You'd seem to be that's what we want. But the issue is that the Moroccan monarchy, which is increasingly unpopular because of the corruption and the repression and the inequality and all sorts of other things, they put so much money, so many lives, so much for so long into this conquest, and they have, and they've convinced their people that the Sahrawis welcome their liberation, and they're just a few Algerian agents who are stirring up trouble, that if they actually went ahead and had a referendum, which the Moroccans almost certainly lose, the backlash could be pretty bad. And so we're scared what would happen to our friend the king. So it's less of an opposition of having independent Western Sahara per se, as one where we we want to have this friendly king who's been our ally initially during the Cold War against leftists and communists, more recently in the so-called War on Terror. They've been very open to U.S. neoliberal kind of economic policies. The Congress passed a free trade agreement with them about 15 years ago. They're even considered a major non-NATO ally, which is a coveted status that only a handful of countries like Japan, Israel, and Australia have. So it's more about keeping this so-called moderate Arab country in our orbit, one that of course has a very strategic position in the northwest corner of Africa, right across from Europe, and one which has had this friendship with the United States going back nearly 230 years.
I mean, that makes more sense as to why we would care so much about what Morocco would actually do and go along with it. I mean, back after 2001 happened, we needed to pretty much be buddy-buddy with Pakistan just because of where they were at to Afghanistan, and we needed their bases and whatnot. And we just sort of, let's say we looked the other way, but nobody talked about what may have been going on within the borders of Pakistan that maybe worked against our interests. We just said, okay, we'll look the other way, but we need your bases, we need your supply lines, we need permission to fly over your country to get to Afghanistan. We just said that's our focus right now, and we'll just make a deal with the devil, so-called, if we have to, with their government.
Or hell, that matter, we made a deal with Karimov, the dictator of Uzbekistan, who's literally boiled opponents in oil and forced thousands of children into the cotton harvest. I mean, this guy. I mean, some of the tyrants that we support around the world. It's embarrassing.
I mean, yeah. I mean, it really is. And that kind of so taking it back to the Ukraine-Russia thing now, like, what is it that we have with Zelensky? Is there something that is there like a deal being made that why we want to support him? Or is it because rightly so he's become pretty much the figurehead? Like, he's the one that's pushing for Ukraine to keep pushing forward, and we're like, we gotta support that guy. I mean, he's standing up for freedom, he's standing up for his country. Or is there something else going on that may be behind the scenes? I mean, I don't know all the details about it, but they made a big deal at the election about the Hunter Biden laptop and how that linked to Ukraine. I don't even know what that was about.
That was all pretty phony. And indeed, the Trump people are actually largely, Paul Manafort and those guys are buddies with Yanukovych and the pro-Russian oligarchs that have at times been in charge. Of course, Yanukovych was supposedly won the 2004 election, but it was everybody agreed it was rigged, and you had this massive nonviolent uprising, which was nicknamed the Orange Revolution. Similar to the people power movements that have brought down Marcos in the Philippines, Milosevic in Serbia, and Mubarak in Egypt, and other autocratic regimes around the world. Then the people that replaced them, however, though they may have been a little pro-Western, a little more liberal, were also corrupt and unpopular. Yanukovych ran again. This time he won legitimately, albeit narrowly, but then his corruption was totally over the top, and he became increasingly repressive. And like Trump, he committed a whole bunch of impeachable offenses, but he couldn't get his party remained loyal. He could get the 2/3 majority, and the last straw was when he reneged on his promise to get closer to the EU and signed this deal with Russia. So you had another uprising in 2014 that forced him out. And what's interesting when you look at the narrative around this, and unfortunately, I've been hearing this from a lot of people from the anti-war left that I generally work with and identify with, is they seem to see this as sort of a U.S. kind of coup, that somehow the U.S. was behind it, Oliver Stone had a film that made this case and this kind of thing, but it's grossly exaggerated. I mean, people say, "Oh, we gave $5 billion to the opposition." No, that $5 billion figure is the entire foreign aid we gave to Ukraine for since independence. And like most foreign aid, some went for good things, some not so good things. But the money that National Endowment for Democracy or whatever gave to the opposition was just maybe a few million, but it didn't make the difference. I mean, it's almost like saying that remembering the Cold War, every leftist revolution was a plot from the Kremlin. Reagan said that Moscow had a hit list, that the Nicaraguans were happy and the El Salvadorans were happy until the the Soviets came in and stirred things up. But in both cases, it denies agency. It's somebody referred to it as West-splaining. West-splaining. Those of the West, we see it in kind of the broader geopolitical context, but we don't see what civil society is saying. We're not seeing what the Ukrainians themselves are doing. And Ukrainians, like any other people, are fallible. They can elect lousy leaders. They can make strategically questionable political judgments and things like that. But it's their struggle. And so to this idea, we shouldn't reduce it to just this is East versus West. This is a people fighting for their freedom. And so, which is why, someone like me who has literally written books about U.S. interventions and coups, and I'm a critic. I'm proud to say I'm an anti-imperialist. But we are not responsible for Ukraine. This idea of, people seem to think the United States is impotent either for good or for ill. Like in Syria, there's some people, blaming Obama for the carnage because he didn't intervene enough, and some people are blaming for the carnage for intervening too much. This is a much more complex world than in the 1950s when we really could come in and overthrow governments and coups. We don't have that kind of power, and we really need to. And so I really do think that in this case, the U.S. support for Ukraine is the same reason the Europeans and virtually everybody else is doing this. They are victims of aggression, and that it really is a moral a crusade in a lot of ways. And it feels weird for me to say this because I've always been a cynic about U.S. foreign policy. I really have, and I've called out these altruistic motives for imperialistic enterprises like invading Iraq and that kind of thing. But in this case, I think we're right that this is a clear-cut case of aggression. And Zelensky, an accidental president, he was a comic actor, and has risen to the task, and people are admiring him, and are supporting the Ukrainians as they should.
Yeah, I pretty much think that whatever intelligence that Putin had on Ukraine and what he could do, most of that would turn out to be wrong. Almost the same way that when we went into Iraq in 2003 was, there's weapons everywhere at mass destruction, and they really weren't there. So we had egg on our face there. But you brought up Oliver Stone a little bit ago. Did you watch the 5-part interview he did with Putin? And
I couldn't stomach it, frankly. I didn't get that far.
I was going to ask you about that because there was if you watched that and you didn't know anything else about Putin, you would swear, this whole thing, it's all the U.S.'s fault. He's an awesome, he clearly is telling the truth. But the more you watch it, the more you can see the narcissism coming out through his interpretations and what he's saying. And it's like, what game is he playing here?
And the weird thing is that people are kind of looking at him in terms of in Soviet eyes. Some of the political cartoons, they have hammers and sickles. You have there's the University of Florida renamed the Karl Marx Room, retaliation of what Russia's doing. But Putin may have been a communist in his youth, but by any measure, he's right wing as hell. He is his allies in Europe are these far right anti-immigration parties, like Le Pen in France and these guys. Obviously, the Trump people, they're very close. He helped get Trump elected. He helped make Brexit happen. He's really been he's frankly a racist, an Islamophobe, and homophobe. He's aligning with some of the most reactionary elements of the Russian Orthodox Church. He's he's very right wing, which is really weird. Where some leftists are trying to rationalize for him, and maybe they're looking back to the days of the Soviet Union, as screwed up as the Soviet system was. At least they did support national liberation struggles in South Africa and some other places, but the Russia today, it is so far removed from anything remotely resembling socialism or remotely resembling anything that one might call progressive.
So with that, it's kind of funny to actually say that because he's so right wing and whatnot. You would think that with Trump in office, more would have gotten done. But it seems like he just sort of, patronized Putin for so long that we didn't really get any U.S. interest out of it. Or am I wrong there? Were we getting help by the Russians, or were we getting our influence in that state when Trump was in office?
We don't know. Maybe it'll come out eventually. Trump may have been getting something out of it, and frankly, that's all he cares about is himself. So, he's part of the scary right-wing populism we've seen elsewhere around the world, in Hungary and Poland and Philippines and Brazil, and of course with Trump in the United States. But one thing that positive that could come out of this tragedy is, I think that it's forced a number of these folks to backpedal. Orban in Hungary, some of the Republicans, Trump-type Republicans, are backpedaling a little bit. He's really crossed a line here, and I think when people see the civilian death toll and just the horrors of it, I mean, people can. People can ignore Yemen and the slaughter there from the Saudi bombing. People rationalize for Israel's terror bombing of apartment blocks and media centers and things like that on the grounds that they're supposedly fighting terrorists and et cetera. It's unfortunately easy for some people to rationalize for war crimes, including heavy bombing of urban areas, but. It's harder here, both because the victim is an allied country, and the person doing the invading is not a popular figure in this country, but also, and I hate to say this, is that I think there are people, and some journalists have been caught on camera, saying these things, we essentially, Americans, white Americans, identify more with Ukrainians because they're white, because they're Christian, because they live in a modern, society that resembles ours. And so, there's both, I think, a degree of unaware racism operating here, but also the fact that this is because it's an advanced industrialized country. You have media. We are seeing this horrors unfold in real time, and there's a greater identity with the victims.
Do you really think that the oligarchs of Russia that we hear so much about, that they really have influence with Putin, that they can really hold his strings, or pretty much where they're just being used as another way to say, well, if we cut their funding, it's magically going to get to Putin?
Well, the problem is that these people are oligarchs because of Putin. These are not self-made men. These are people who got in their position because this is crony capitalism, basically. They got rich because,
ironically,
Putin gives them basically when the Soviet Union denationalized everything, because obviously in the communist system the state owned everything, and they farmed it out, to various favored people, including these ex-communists who were quick to switch to become born-again capitalists. If you wanted power in a communist country, you became a communist. You want power in a capitalist country, you become a capitalist. So it's not about ideology; it's about power.
Right.
But the thing is that they are dependent on Putin more than the other way around. So, for example, every once in a while you hear about an oligarch that splits with Putin, and what happens? He immediately gets indicted for corruption. Now they're all corrupt, but they essentially lost their immunity by coming out against him. So the oligarchs are in a classic hard place. They're getting their, if they stick with Putin, they're losing everything from all the sanctions and people seizing their yachts and whatever. But if they split with Putin, they're going to lose even more. So on the one hand, Russia is much more integrated in the international economy than the Soviet Union. So sanctions and that kind of pressure do have a chance of working, but the way the system is working, the oligarchs don't really have that much power over Putin. The irony is that our oligarchs are actually more powerful in terms. They can do more to tell politicians how to vote than and what to do than the Russian oligarchs. Where I do think the sanctions are going to have effect is that I think that there will be enough ordinary Russians seeing things going bad to worse because of Putin's adventurism. When words get out, there are a lot of young men are getting killed and coming back in body bags. I mean, they have already in these 4 weeks lost more soldiers than the U.S. did in 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan combined, and even higher at this point. And we've seen resistance before. I mean, in Chechnya, you had these mothers coming down, finding their sons, bringing their civilian clothes, and saying, "You're coming home now." And we've seen we've seen acts of resistance, like the news producer, who put the sign behind the announcer, and leading entertainment figures and others. I think I think the biggest hope really may be from Russian civil society, who, and I mean, in fact, not only do I believe that Putin's going to lose in terms of conquering Ukraine, I think he may lose his presidency over this, because this is turning into a total fiasco.
Well, the danger that I fear with that one is that if he does see the writing on the wall and he knows that his days are numbered in the Kremlin, does he press the magic button with all the nuclear arms and say, "Well, if I'm going to go out, I'm going to go out swinging"?
But of course, you also have to have the soldiers who are willing to actually flick the switch.
That's true.
And this is there is a and this is we're seeing this in terms of the regular soldiers. They're punching holes in their own gas tanks, and they are there's all sorts of little acts of resistance going on. And of course, and even in cities that they've conquered, you've had tens of thousands of people coming out in the streets saying, "You may physically control." I mean, you may have your tanks in the streets, you may have your people in the mayor's office, but we do not recognize your authority. And remember, the Ukrainians overthrew 2 governments using massive non-cooperation like this.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's hard to engage in nonviolent action when your city is being bombed. But what the interesting thing is that even if Russia does end up taking over some of these cities, they don't necessarily control them. And what do they have? If a government's only ultimately as powerful as people's willingness to obey it.
Well, that's the thing. You put a puppet government in Kyiv, let's say, for example, but the population's already not going to support him. I mean, that's just destined to fail anyway. So what is the real end game? Which I think maybe behind the scenes, they're backdoor channels. It's like, can we get something through to Putin where on the face of it he can look like he won, but at the back of the house we solved the problem?
I think it's quite possible, but again, I can't say exactly what this is. But I mean, I think he's shocked. I mean, just as I think the Bush people who insisted that the Iraqis would welcome us as liberators, and that people don't like to be invaded, and this and the fact that Ukrainians and Russians are despite slightly different languages and everything, or have certain cultural similarities and the like, and most Ukrainians speak fluent Russian. Some of them are talking to the tank commanders. They are they're either by radio or even in person, and they're saying, "Hey, you're being lied to here. This is not what this is about. Do you really want to kill us?" And it's the morale is just awful. There have been interceptions of conversations with these with the troops and what they're dealing with. So it's the fact that they're not moving very far. I mean, they're doing horrible things. Obviously, they're leveling some of these cities, but they will not take over Ukraine. I mean, there's no physical way they're going to do this, and I think they're going to. I mean, I just looking at the map. I think that, they may move a little bit here and there, but they're going to be losing other places. It's not going well.
And with that inevitability, it kind of says, how long do you think the media blackout within Russia can even stay put? Because most Russians of the older generation, from what I understand, support Putin's move because they've been told of there's neo-Nazism going on in Ukraine, and we're going there to save them, and all they're seeing on state television is what the Russian government wants them to see. I mean, how long will it be before they actually see what's really going on there, or will they even see it?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I think but the thing about the internet age is that that censorship can only go so far. that some things do creep through, and that the information can leak out eventually. And as in Vietnam, when the soldiers come home, they tell the stories about what's going on there. I mean, a lot of people forget that the anti-war movement was actually strengthened by returning veterans. Despite the myth about spitting on veterans, the veterans actually in large part supported the Vietnam War because they'd seen with their own eyes the lies and what was going on there. And you had groups like Vietnam Veterans Against the War and others who would tell about their experience and it helped. And hearing stories about what was going on in Vietnam from a veteran has a lot more credibility from some long-haired college student. And so this is. I think we may see a similar phenomenon, taking place in Russia.
It's possible. And I want to ask you about this. I know it's not your area of expertise, but what do you think China's role in all this actually is? I mean, are they thinking about Taiwan and that's centering on everything, or is it more about Russia's our buddies, so we're going to act in their interest? What do you think is going on there?
Well, I think that what they're concerned about is that they are concerned about U.S. hegemony. And sort of they see a rivalry with the West, and Russia was something of an ally, but not necessarily an ally they're totally comfortable with. I mean, I don't see them, sticking their necks out for Russia. They may help them out here or there, but they don't have I don't think they have even with their enormous surplus of capital and everything else. They can't bail Russia out. I mean, they're in so deep, and they don't really trust these people, so they don't want to. They don't want this Putin to be so ignominiously defeated that we get this whole big triumphalism of the West like we did at the end of the Cold War. They want a Russia that is not in the Western orbit. They want Russia as an ally. At the same time, they recognize that Putin's bitten off more than he can chew. They recognize that this is not going well. They recognize that world public opinion is overwhelmingly opposed to Russia. So I don't think they're going to do too much to support them. And in case anybody did have any kind of irredentist ideas about Taiwan, I think just seeing how the Ukrainians are resisting will be a cautionary tale. So I think if anything, it makes it less likely that China is going to do anything dangerous.
Well, that was the whole idea there. Is I thought the day that this whole Ukrainian invasion happened, like this is just a prefigure of what China wants to do with Taiwan and take it back over into China. But seeing what's happening here and the response that the international community has given towards Putin's actions in Ukraine. Do they see that as a precedent of, okay, if we try to take over Taiwan, although we have the military strength to do it, are we going to be subject to the same amount of sanctions that the West has been putting on Russia, which has been unprecedented, the fact that they have all come together that way?
Well, China's a lot more powerful economically and militarily, and not to mention many times bigger than Russia in terms of its population. But at the same time, I think that you are correct, that the reaction has been such, both by the conquered people and the international community, and also if you're also a major economic power like China, you want some stability in the global economy, and wars like this, it's a problem, and so I don't think they want to upset the cart too much.
Well, that's a good way to put it. And I would think that despite all that, if you're the Taiwan government, you may see this as, okay, if China's seeing this happen to Russia, that gives us a little more of a hand to play in terms of our sovereignty here as an island over here. I kind of wanted to get into one of your specialty here is the Israeli-Palestine thing. This has been something it's never gone away. It's been an issue ever since pretty much the end of World War II when Israel became a nation, and just no one's been able to figure out what's actually going on here. And you've been there how many times?
I lost count, but
plenty of times there. So from your perspective, actually being on the ground, which I think speaks more volume than what you can ever read in a history book or what you can see on the media, what is it that you see down there that maybe most Americans don't see about the actual conflict, how people blend together, and what really might be a solution to solving that issue there?
Well, it's not a religious conflict. It's this conflict over land, two people that have historic claims to the same land that in toto is only the size of New Jersey, which if for people who've been back east, is not very big. And there's and they both have attachments to the land. The Palestinians have lived there for many centuries. It's despite our stereotypes of the Middle East, this is not it's not all desert, and in fact it's a California type climate. So they farm the land, they've grazed the land. They have cities. They've had terraced vineyards and olive groves and everything else. I mean, it's like Greece and Italy. I mean, and like most agrarian societies, it's a great attachment to the land. It's not like they can just get on their camels and go to another part of the desert, which is a stereotype that some people have. And of course, for Jews, they see, after suffering as a minority and waves of oppression over the centuries and going to the land of their forefathers. I mean, there's obviously a very, very close attachment to the land there as well. And the thing is, there's a need to share it. Now, in the earlier days, it was the Arabs that were rejecting compromise, but in more recent years, it's been the other way around. Virtually every Arab state says they're willing to recognize Israel, have security guarantees if Israel withdraws from the occupied territory. Some countries have recognized Israel already, and the Palestinians have agreed. And the Palestine Authority, the PLO, the Fatah. The mainline Palestinian groups have all accepted that. Hamas doesn't, but Hamas is not the majority. They're only in the Gaza Strip. Israel, however, has become more and more right-wing. In fact, the current prime minister rules out categorically the existence of a Palestinian state. And that's a problem because the U.S. position, as the chief mediator of the conflict, is that it's up to the two sides to work it out themselves. Well, if one side, which is the occupier, which has the onus of responsibility for ending the occupation, refuses to end the occupation, refuses to even consider a state. And then the United States says, oh, but we won't pressure Israel. We will not reduce our $4 billion of military aid. We will veto any UN Security Council resolution that pressures Israel to do anything. We not only oppose armed resistance by the Palestinians, we oppose nonviolent civil society campaigns like boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. And we will oppose any recognition of Palestinian statehood by the United Nations or anybody else. And so, so the United States is in a contradictory position of being both the chief mediator in the conflict and the chief military, financial and diplomatic supporter of one of the two parties, by far the most powerful of the two parties. And that's the thing. I mean, even people like, I think more and more Americans recognize that both Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs have the right to security and self-determination. But what a lot of people don't recognize is the gross asymmetry in power between the occupier and the occupied. And the big problem for me, and as someone who's talked about a two-state solution, for decades now, the idea of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip with a shared co-capital, Jerusalem, that would give the Palestinians only 22% of historic Palestine. So we're talking down to Delaware size now. But the U.S. and Israeli position is that's too much. You have to settle for less. You got to allow the Israelis to incorporate all these illegal settlements that they've colonized the whole area, which divides the West Bank up into Swiss cheese. I mean, that was what the Trump supposed peace plan was about. But you now have 600,000 Israeli colonists in the occupied territories. Would they all move back to Israel and allow the Palestinian refugees to take over their settlements? I don't think so. They're there to stay. The Israelis, with U.S. funding, have built these Jewish-only highways, to these Jewish-only settlements. They got the water rights, to water their lawns while the village well, the nearby Palestinian community, is drying up. For years I shied away from using the term apartheid, but my last few times there, I mean, seriously, it is when you have when Palestinians can only be in certain areas and have to carry a special pass to get one place to another, that they're hard for the menial jobs, it really does resemble an apartheid type system. I mean, even Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch And even Israeli human rights groups like B'Tselem are now using that word. And so it raises the question: is a viable two-state solution possible? Are we going to have to now start talking about a single binational state? But whatever it is, whether it be a two-state solution or a binational state, I think the principle of equality is critically important. That both Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs need to have the right to exist in security and self-governance, in whatever way that may be worked out. And the big the big issue, the U.S. says it supports a two-state solution, but we recognize Israel, but don't recognize Palestine. We recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, but not Palestine's capital. We condemn Palestinian attacks against Israeli civilians, but we rationalize and defend the far more devastating Israeli attacks against Palestinian civilians. I mean, you go down the list. This is, we're not being an honest broker, and anybody who studies conflict resolution or negotiation or mediation, if you're going to be the mediator, you got to be even-handed, and the United States is just the opposite.
Did this whole thing start as far as what you would call the more extreme right end of what the Israeli government has been now? Did that start after 2001, after the 9/11, when we said, okay, because now we have to go, get the terrorists in Afghanistan. Now we need Israel more. Now we're going to say, all right, let's play the game more.
Yeah. I've always argued. I mean, we're trending in that direction even back in the Clinton years. But I've long argued that our strong bias of support for Israel is not because of a pro-Israel lobby. We don't have a Moroccan American lobby getting us to support Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara. There wasn't an Indonesian American lobby that forced us to recognize Indonesia's brutal 25-year occupation of East Timor. Our government, unfortunately, is perfectly capable of supporting allied governments, invade, occupy, colonize, oppress weaker neighbors without some domestic lobbying group forcing our hand to do so. And but I think Israel is seen, as in the words of one former Secretary of State, our unsinkable aircraft carrier. I mean, our Arab allies could be overthrown, a coup or revolution, but the Israelis are going to be there. And we work with Mossad and CIA, collaborate in intelligence gathering, covert operation. The military-industrial complexes of the two countries are closely intertwined. They have supported pro-Western governments and pro-Western insurgencies. They are their Air Force controls the skies. It's largely a strategic relationship, and just like various. I mean, Israel at least is a democracy for its at least for its Jewish citizens, but it's just the same reason the U.S. has supported various dictators around the world. If they can support our strategic interests, we'll turn a blind eye to their human rights abuses. But the irony is that U.S. policy has not only failed to bring justice for the Palestinians, it's really failed to bring security for the Israelis. I mean, Hamas would not exist if the Palestinians had gotten a viable independent state back at the time of Oslo. I mean, Hamas had maybe 10-15% support back then, but when Palestinians saw that the Oslo Accords only led to more and more settlements, more and more seizure of Palestinian land, and the Palestine Authority grew increasingly corrupt because the U.S. and to certain Europeans would say, well, we'll just keep playing along with this, and we'll give you all these goodies, and pretend that you're going to get a viable state someday when it's looking less and less likely you will. I mean, Hamas seemed attractive to some people, as violent and reactionary and terrible as they may be. So really, I think the United States has a lot to blame for the failure of the peace process to go forward. I think one reason Israeli politics have gone so far to the right is that up to the time of George H.W. Bush, the U.S. was willing to put some pressure on Israel occasionally. They would do if they went too far, it would hurt their relations with the United States, which is really important. But since the Clinton years, and especially with Bush and Trump, Israel's gotten a blank check. So why should they compromise? The other thing is the demographics. Just that the more liberal secular Israelis who are more open to compromise tend to have small families, and the more orthodox conservative nationalist Jews tend to have very big families. And if you're a small country like Israel, it doesn't take very long for that to shift the demographics. So the Labor Party that ruled Israel in its first 25, 30 years, and briefly in the 90s. They are they're social democrats. The kibbutz movement. I mean, people like Bernie Sanders and Noam Chomsky, spent 6 months living in Israel working on a kibbutz. It was kind of a progressive kind of thing. I mean, even back then they had some contradictions in terms of these great socialist communes were on stolen land in many cases. But there was the real positive feeling that a lot of American liberals had for Israel. It was actually well placed. It was a progressive, democratic bastion in a country that was in a part of the world that was pretty reactionary and autocratic. But and I think a lot of Americans still see, especially older Americans, have this kind of idealistic view of Israel. Just like certain leftists have these starry-eyed views of certain socialist countries, even when they became increasingly authoritarian and whatever, because they wanted to believe in it so much. They assumed that the criticism was all propaganda. And unfortunately, in some cases, it's true. In the case of Israel, Israel's gotten very, very right wing, and more and more explicitly racist. And but U.S. policy still seems like it's stuck in the 60s or 70s in terms of this kind of unconditional support and the denial of just how extreme Israeli politics have been. And there's also, of course, the fact that it is the world's only Jewish state. I mean, as critical as I am of Israel, if I walk into a room and I hear somebody going on and on about all the terrible things Israel's doing, even if I agree with everything they're saying, I have to ask myself, why are they saying that really? Are they saying it because they're concerned about human rights and international law and that kind of thing everywhere? Or there's an excuse to go after the world's only Jewish state? I mean, if there's only one black state in the world, you can imagine that a lot of African Americans and progressive whites might be a little defensive sometimes. Even if the justification is, even if the criticism is justified, because you kind of got to wonder, where are these people coming from that are being so critical?
And what's your real motivation behind all that?
Exactly,
That's one thing we don't know. It's funny that you mentioned that about the older generation of Israelites who've been more open to saying compromise, and because they have a sort of a predisposition to what the old days were, and this is how it is, and all this other stuff is just fluff. Almost like the older generation of Russians now who maybe believe in a certain what Putin's actually doing because they were raised that way, and this is what we saw. Kind of going back to that. What do you think Israel's government's take is on this whole situation with Russia and Ukraine? Because they seem to be a little more trying to play both sides of this. Like, what's their ties to Russia, even though they should, in theory, should be more on the U.S.'s side because of the relation there?
Well, Prime Minister Bennett and many of the more right-wing members of the coalition government are actually part of this kind of right-wing, racist, populist kind of political movements that Putin and Trump and people like that are in. And there also there's a fair number of Israeli leaders who are of Russian background, and they have ties there. There's also, of course, Israel obviously has no compunctions about countries expanding their territory by force. And invading their neighbors, annexing them, and based on some historical claim, and so there's the identity there. So, and their business ties. I mean, there are a whole number of reasons. But like some of the Republicans, who were seen to almost neutral or even somewhat pro-Putin in the early days, are starting to backpedal a little bit and are starting to say, hey, this is going too far. This is wrong. This isn't good. And but I think they also don't want to displease the United States. I mean, Biden might not get too upset or put any pressure on them if they're just killing or exploiting Palestinians. But if they're trying to undermine the United States in this crisis situation with Ukraine, I think there he would definitely put his foot down.
I would think so at that point. I mean, it's just, you're almost, no matter how much that we have such ties, especially with the military-industrial complex here, that, you have to support us in this neighborhood over here. And speaking of the military-industrial complex, that's been sort of like the elephant in the room with everything here, is because of the money that flows into military arms throughout the world. Is there an incentive to just keep these sort of conflicts going because, we need to sell more Stinger missiles, we need to sell more javelins, we need to sell more tanks, and, so you guys keep fighting it out. What's your take on that?
I don't think we're seeing that in a conspiratorial sense, but I do think overall that, the fact that we're, the United States has long pushed military solutions to complex political problems, I think underscores a lot of this. I mean, the fact that seeing 9/11, not as a crime of a serious crime that required emphasis on intelligence and interdiction, and where appropriate, paramilitary raids like the one that did eventually kill bin Laden, but instead we put it as a war on terrorism, which required trillions of dollars in military spending, new carrier groups, and we have a $20 billion carrier group, launching a $50 million jet fighter, that fires a $5 million missile to kill a couple guys in a pickup truck. This is, and you gotta, and of course, this kind of thing, you often end up, blowing up a wedding party or somebody civilian. In tribal societies, people end up, seeking revenge, and we end up creating terrorists faster than we can kill them. And so, I think that it creates more and more problems. I mean, why do we still have troops in Iraq? Well, they say to fight ISIS and to fight these Iranian and to counter the influence of these Iranian militia. Well, there was no ISIS or Iranian militia until we invaded, and because Saddam was anti-Iranian and anti-Salafist, and ISIS is a direct outgrowth. I mean, the ISIS leadership were people who were jailed and tortured in U.S. prisons during the counterinsurgency war in Iraq, and we helped install these pro-Iranian parties into office in Iraq, and now we're having to deal with that. So each of these military adventures ends up creating a new problem, that is then justified to include more militarism. And again, there, as I kind of alluded to earlier, how much of the eastward expansion of NATO was an effort to help the military-industrial complex in the post-Cold War world, when a lot of us were hoping that we would dramatically demilitarize and to not be spending so much money on these far-flung military alliances.
Well, that's the thing. It's a good thing you brought that up, because with the two NATO expansions, the big ones, I think 94 and 2003, I believe it was, when the Baltics came into play there. And Putin always brings this up because I guess there was some sort of handshake agreement between Gorbachev and H.W. Bush that, hey, don't worry about it. If you work with us, Mikhail, then we're not going to expand, and you have my word. But nothing was ever written down, and he keeps bringing that up. Well, yeah, you're right. We didn't write anything down, so shame on us. But you guys did say that you weren't going to let NATO expand. So then after the breakup of the Soviet Union, when NATO started to expand slowly, was that, in your opinion, was that more of a push from the West to say, let's get closer to the Russian border? Or do you think the actual countries themselves said, we would rather be in a military alliance with the West because we don't want Russia to come back and take us over?
I mean, I think it was, I don't think the United States, despite what the Russian anthropologist says, has any desire to, take over the Russia or control it. In fact, Yeltsin was pretty much our buddy for a time anyway. I don't think there was any need to. But yeah, sure, the military-industrial complex and the Pentagon, they like having a bigger alliances and more influence and more sales and things like that. But the people of Eastern Europe, really did want that, because, I mean, even those of us on the left have to acknowledge, even those who are very critical of U.S. imperialism and things like that, if you're an Eastern European, it's not the United States you're worried about. It's not U.S. imperialism that's threatened you over the decades and centuries. It's Russia, And so, quite naturally, they would look at, and I mean, it's no accident that once the dictatorships fell in Eastern Europe and in Latin America, the Latin Americans tend to vote left, and the Eastern Europeans voted right, because they were trying, they were, it was a reaction to the hegemon that had oppressed them and supported these autocratic allies. And it was a way of asserting their independence, and a way of asserting some of these were responsible center-left and center-right politicians, but you also got your Orbans and your Maduros, as well. But the point being is that going back to your original question, that is. Yeah, there's overwhelming support for NATO in Eastern Europe. Now, if I was an Eastern European, I'd probably be in the minority, because again, I have questions about that. But I have to acknowledge I would be in a minority.
That would make sense over there, definitely, because if you're Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, for example, and you've been oppressed by Russia for how many, hundreds of years, when you go back to way back in the very beginning, it's by having a military alliance with NATO, at least we guarantee our security from the Russian influence coming back. Yeah. And be able to have more of a democratic or European Union tie economically to make ourselves prosperous. Yeah. Wouldn't you think that if you're Russia, if everybody was thinking more sane here, that you can still try to have an economic relation with the Baltic states in a way where you can benefit economically from that by trading with them more? Or is it really just because the NATO armies are at my doorstep, even though there's no reason to actually go to war, that I want to take that territory back because it's...
I mean, if he was rational, he would take advantage of Russia's relative size to enter in economic relations that would be mutually beneficial. I mean, the United States, think of all the American farmers and all the other companies would benefit if we had normal trade relationship with Cuba. But that doesn't stop the politicians who do tend to see things in these rigid kind of geopolitical ways where they can't tolerate an alternative system at their doorstep, and they're willing to shoot themselves in the foot rather than be willing to compromise.
Yeah, you would think it would make sense if you're Putin, you want to really stay in power and have actual support from within your entire country to make good relations with the former Soviet republics and recognize them as independent. Mm-hmm. Maybe wouldn't give them the need to say we need a NATO backing because we're afraid of you, but rather than you can just enjoy free trade and let them trade with Europe. And that whole deal with Yanukovych when he reneged on the EU deal to take that deal with Russia, and the population rebelled. It was, if Western Ukraine wants to be more European, and they're the majority of the country as far as I believe that they are, then bring that into the country. Right?
Yeah, and part of it, I should mention that the division between East and West is not just in terms of language. The western part of Ukraine is largely agricultural, and they would benefit greatly from being part of the EU. Whereas the eastern part is kind of Rust Belt type industrial, and they would benefit more from Putin style, patronage and subsidies and the oligarch kind of system. So a lot of it had to do more with economic self-interest than what language that they spoke.
So do you think that possibly, I don't know if anybody will actually agree to this, that a possible solution would be to split Ukraine, maybe along the Dnieper River, to say, okay, you're the more Russian side, and if you really want to be a part of Russia, we'll make an agreement happen and let us be separate countries, or nope, these are the borders and we're going to stick to it.
I think that in general, the principles of recognizing international borders are good ones, but I think in this kind of situation there could be some flexibility on that. But I think there would have to be a referendum, and it would have to be free and fair. I mean, the Crimea referendum again was a joke. Yeah. And the fact is that there is a lot of opposition, even in the Russian ethnic Russian area, to Russian control. And we're hearing about Mariupol right now. You see this being destroyed as we speak. But it's not, and the Russians have, last I heard, have indeed entered the main part of the city, or what's left of it. But it's not the first time that Russians had taken it, because in the early days of the fighting in 2014, when they tried to declare a separate state, these ethnic Russian militias who are technically Ukrainians, but were being backed by the Russian army, seized the center of town, set the barricades, and said, okay, we're the government of this independent republic of whatever. And there are 5,000 steelworkers and miners and other citizens who marched unarmed into the center of the city, removed the barricades, and basically ran these armed thugs out of town. And there's Zelensky himself is ethnic Russian. We are not. It's not a clear-cut thing. So I think, So I think flexibility on borders, is fine, but I think it needs to be, based on the desires of the people there. Not just somebody in some foreign capital with a map.
Well, that kind of brings up a bigger point that I've always wanted to ask somebody, and you have a lot of knowledge on this. Then, what is really the point of the United Nations if what they stand for we really can't even enforce? We looked like the other way with Crimea and just said, yeah, it was a violation. That's pretty much it. We just left it there.
Because obviously, Russia could veto any kind of resolution,
right?
As they have on Ukraine. But actually, if you look at the UN vetoes the past 50 years. The United States has vetoed far more than any other country.
Oh, really?
In most cases, we've been the sole negative vote. 14-1 on quite a few issues. A lot of them have to do with Israel, but on a number of other items as well. And the veto power has been abused by the United States, by Russia, by other countries. The early days of the UN, the Soviet Union was vetoing things constantly. I wish there was a supermajority. I wish there was that the permanent members weren't. Why is France and Britain permanent permanent and not India or Japan or Brazil or any number of Germany, any number of other countries. Why 4 of the 5 Security Council countries white? And that's certainly not representative of the world as a whole. So obviously, UN is a desperate need of reform. But of course, to reform it, you have to bypass the veto somehow, which you can't. It's a problem, but. I still think that despite all of this, the world would be a lot worse off without the United Nations. That it does offer an opportunity to bring things forward, to get people to talk, and that to reach some compromises in some situations. Not often when they involve the great powers, but they do indeed move things forward. The problem, of course, is unfortunately because the United States has attacked many UN agencies when they've gone against us or Israel. It kind of hurts us to when we're trying to deal with Russia, for example. We've constantly attacked the United Nations Human Rights Council because it has been willing to criticize Israel and other U.S. allies. We have attacked the International Court of Justice. We've attacked the International Criminal Court. In fact, U.S. law forbids the United States from even cooperating with the ICC, and even to cut foreign aid to countries that do. Though there's a waiver the president can do, and they have done. The World Court and other. It has been attacked for various. For criticizing the U.S. for attacking Nicaragua in the 80s, and for Israel for building a separation wall deep inside occupied territory in a serpentine fashion to incorporate these illegal settlements. And not just by Republicans. Biden has been a leader in his UN bashing over the years. And so now that we'd like to have the ICC, the World Court, the UN HRC and other groups, stand up for this against the Russians with their horrific abuses of human rights and international law. it puts us in a weak position because we have dismissed and criticized and disparaged these very institutions that we really need right now.
I mean, when you really put it out there that way and you say exactly what we've allowed and then what we now have to come back and say, well, if we allowed all this, do we have the right to say this about what's going on now? And, I think that's one of the key things that you always hear from the Russian side, from the Putin side, that he kind of throws at us. It's like, hey, you did A, B, and C, so why are you mad at me if I do this? And in a way, he has a point because he's not wrong about what has happened within our government. But at the same time, we have to draw the line.
I really bristle at the kind of whataboutism that you hear when people say horrible things that Russia's doing. What about the But it's not yes but, it's yes and, in the sense that yes, let's acknowledge where the United States has fallen short in terms of human rights and international law. Acknowledge where our allies, Morocco, Israel, Saudi Arabia, have gone and work to change our government's policies of supporting the terrible things that our allies are doing. And let's stand up to Russian aggression and oppression of Chinese, the Uyghurs, and everything else. Because again, this is, as we said at the outset of our discussion today, that it's important that we not let ideology or geopolitics get in the way of principle or the rule of law. And unless until we are able to apply these principles consistently, regardless of ideology, regardless of geopolitics, we're going to be having crises like this. We're going to have Russia trying to take over Ukraine. We're going to have Morocco trying to take over Western Sahara. We're going to have refugees. We're going to have cities burning. We're going to have the horrors that we are seeing on our TV screens every night.
And in Putin's perfect world, if let's say he did accomplish his mission in Ukraine, do you really think he would stop there? And if not, who do you think thinks next? Because everybody else who would be next is pretty much a NATO country.
Well, I'm not. For one thing, it's not going to happen because it's been so difficult. He's not going. I mean, just like the neocons in the Bush administration who were talking about moving on to Syria or Iran after invading Iraq.
True.
It was not going to. It was not in the cards. But yeah, even hypothetically. I don't think that you go much further. It's simply because I think there really is a unique historical ties between Ukraine and Russia that did not exist with these other. Maybe Belarus to an extent, but they're pretty much a puppet. Anyway. Again, not close enough ties to justify unilaterally taking them over. But there is something special about Ukraine and Russia that does not exist with Moldova or the Baltic republics or some of the others. So I was never worried about that per se, but I do think that in any of these cases, there is a matter of precedent, and that's why I keep talking about Western Sahara. What are you talking about? Western Sahara is only 500,000 people. Most people have never heard of it, whatever. But if the United States gets its way, and it gets the UN, the international community, to recognize Morocco's sovereignty over Western Sahara, it will be the first time since the signing of the United Nations Charter that a country has been allowed to expand its borders by force and get away with it. It will be the first time that there's been an incomplete decolonization. A recognized colony, a recognized non-self-governing territory has not been given its right to self-determination. You got to think about the precedent that causes. So that's why I say I believe the Sahrawis should have their freedom because they should have their freedom no matter how small their population is. Mm-hmm. But more importantly for me, it's what kind of precedent are we setting? Is the 21st century going to be about the right of self-determination, or is it the right of conquest? Is it about the rule of law, or who has the biggest guns or the most powerful allies?
That's really something there. And if there's one thing that I've learned just in these few weeks from the whole Ukraine invasion is all of a sudden nobody's talking about the pandemic anymore. They found a new topic and they went straight to that. And really, when you break it down, and we've been talking for about an hour and a half here, and just in that short amount of time, if you were somebody who never even knew about some of the things that are going on back at the house, you really see that all the workings of international relations really transpires political lines, whether you're on the left or you're on the right, that some of these issues will still stay there no matter who's in power, no matter what they believe in, and that this whole thing here really has a lot more underneath the surface, almost like an iceberg. You see here what you see on the media, but below the surface, there's really so many more ties that really keeps this whole thing going within this whole conflict in the world.
But one thing that gives me hope, and that is the power of global civil society, which, thanks to new communication technologies and thanks to social movements and the like, that despite the horrible things that are going on, people can make a difference. That the whole so-called realist paradigm, that might makes right, that if a dictator or whatever wants to do their thing and they have the guns, they can do it. I mean, the fact that we have had over 60 autocratic governments overthrown by democratic civil society organizations employed using methods of nonviolent resistance. Now, not all these democratic transitions were held or were smooth, but it was a lot more successful than armed revolution or expecting reform from above or a foreign invader trying to impose democracy. It was people themselves that did it. Similarly, there was, foreign investors in apartheid South Africa. They got twice the return than anywhere else in the world, because you had the combination of an affluent white consumer society and an exploited poor black labor force. But the movements for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against apartheid South Africa eventually forced corporations and governments, including our own, after fighting it for years, to finally agree to put sanctions on South Africa, which was critical in the decision, along with, of course, the ongoing resistance in the townships, to free Nelson Mandela and negotiate majority rule. East Timor was a hopeless cause. It was as obscure as Western Sahara was 25, 30 years ago. But again, civil society movements around the world effectively shamed our governments, particularly the United States, which is Indonesia's big backer, to stop their unconditional aid and end the slaughter. And the people of East Timor are now free. So that's what gives me hope for places like Western Sahara, for the Palestinians, for other people living under dictatorships around the world, is that ordinary citizens really can make a difference. They can mobilize. They can use their resources through non-cooperation, through popular mobilization, and so and the trends have been growing in that direction in terms of I mean in the past. Over the past 5 years, you've had more Americans involved in more protests and more protest overall than any time in American history, including the 1960s. So people are mobilized. This is happening around the world, and so that's where, despite all the terrible things we've been talking about today, I really do actually hold out a fair amount of hope.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because I want to end this on a more of a positive note. And if you could give your advice to Generation Z, the really young people who are coming up and they see the world now, they don't necessarily understand how we kind of got here from way back when. What would be a piece of advice that you would give them as for inspiration, what to look forward to specifically to that generation?
Well, don't underestimate the power of ordinary people to create change. That it's that people need to mobilize, to build coalitions, even people you might not agree with on certain other issues. And also the importance of nonviolent discipline. And this is not a moral thing about nonviolence per se, but I'm speaking as a strategic analyst. Mm-hmm. We've seen that nonviolent movements are actually more powerful than armed struggles or other forms of violence, because you end up creating more allies, and the numbers are what's really key. It makes it more difficult for the oppressor to oppress you, get away with oppressing you if you're non-violent, and you have such a great variety of tactics from strikes to boycotts to occupations to popular contestation of public space. I mean, there are so many things that people can do. And so I would say, to keep to realize there's hope, realize that popular struggle can be hard sometimes, but it can also be fun. You can really build community and get away from this kind of atomized society where in front of our computers half the time and actually have people time. And it is so exciting to be part of a popular struggle for good, and to see the benefits and see your victories along the way.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. That's a very good point to make, and I really hope it resonates with a lot of young people because they really need to hear it. You mentioned really quick, we won't get into it because it's a big rabbit hole to get into, but the technology now and just how so many people are tied to, or the young people especially, tied to phones and iPads and computers, and losing a lot of the social interaction. A lot of social media can be good for getting information out there, but then it may give you a narrow view of what's actually going on. Mm-hmm. But to be able to say that there are ways to be out to get your message out, there are ways to work to help other people in different countries who live a different lifestyle that you may never know of because you've never been there to see the dynamics of what actually goes on. That just hearing all that can help you try to make a better world for everybody. And I have, I'm very optimistic about the future. I really think that despite what we're seeing now and what we have seen, and we can't make any excuses for what has happened in the past, but that going forward, it's going to be a bigger change positively for the rest of the world. So thank you, Stephen, for coming out. I really appreciate it again. Where can people find you if they have questions?
Well, you can check out my website. It's www.stephenzunes.org. That's StephenZunes.
Great. And there were some really great articles on there, so I encourage everybody who's listening to this to go check out his website because he has some really good, interesting points of view about everything that we talked about today, from Western Africa all the way to how it relates back to Ukraine and Russia. And you really get to see how everything really gets put together in modern politics. So, Stephen, thank you again for coming out. I really appreciate it. To everybody who's watching, thank you for watching. Please, if you can, subscribe to the YouTube channel and like the video. That is what I need to get the message put out there. So if YouTube sees that everybody likes the video, they will push it out to more people to get the message out. Thank you again, Stephen. Everybody have a good day. Bye.